everyone. Welcome to your newest episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your host, myself, Laura Matsu, and my husband, Bernhard Gunther. And on this episode, we are going to be offering 12 psycho-spiritual tools for spiritual warfare. So in this episode, we're basically going to share and discuss the 12 main psycho-spiritual tools that we find are necessary during these times of spiritual warfare. And these tools will not only help you in your immediate everyday life and your relationships with the people around you, but it will also help the world. So as you can see, there's a lot of collective darkness. There's a lot of cynicism. A lot of people are in this very negative, what we call black-pilled mindset that's dominant lately. And I can understand why. The past few years have been really difficult for almost everyone, physically, emotionally, spiritually. The positive side of this is it seems that more and more people are becoming aware that this is a spiritual war. But what does that actually mean for this to be a spiritual war? We're going to cover that in this podcast. We're going to talk about how we see this spiritual war playing out in the spiritual realms. We're going to talk about our own personal experiences with that, as well as quote other spiritual masters and what they had to say about the spiritual war that we're in these times. So while many people talk about the spiritual war, I've just noticed that there seems to be very little offered as far as solutions, except for maybe pray. But ultimately, we believe that we can only win the spiritual war by raising collective consciousness, by evolving consciousness. But again, how do we actually raise consciousness and what does that entail? So that's what we're going to cover in this podcast through these tools that we feel are essential for raising consciousness in times of spiritual warfare. And these tools are not only to help you individually in your life, but also help you navigate these times with more ease. And the way that we see it, the more of us who individually raise our own consciousness, the more that we help the world. So we all have a piece and a part to play in this spiritual war through raising consciousness. That's the only way that we're going to get out of this situation. But before we go into that, I just want to make a quick announcement. We are going to begin registration for another round of Embodied Soul Awakening, which is our 14-week program in psycho-spiritual self-work. The registration is going to open in about a week. So if you want to join or get more information about that, you can go to thetimeoftransition.com. That's thetimeoftransition.com. And you can sign up to the waiting list. And we'll also put the link in the show notes, right?
Correct.
Okay, perfect. And that is going to be a round that begins in September, late October. Okay, so let's just talk first about, maybe you can just give them an overview on why this is a spiritual war, how this relates to spiritual forces, and how they work through us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for people who have been listening to our podcast and familiar with my work, I've been talking about this for many, many years. It ties into the hyperdimensional aspect of reality and the hyperdimensional matrix control system. But basically, a spiritual war means based on non-physical forces influencing humanity or working through humanity. So the war is on unseen levels. And all the different esoteric spiritual traditions have talked about this in their own ways throughout the ages. But we don't recognize it in our very Western materialistic view of the modern world right now, so to speak. We're kind of stuck in 5th century perception. But what we're actually seeing on the 3D physical level is the manifestation of occult, hidden spiritual forces manipulating humanity from non-physical realms, and they are working through humanity. That's the key point. So spiritual warfare is not necessarily out there like we see it maybe in the physical reality, but the key point to understand that it works through humanity and ultimately through ourselves. Hence, we really want to also emphasize in this episode on the tools to help you navigate the spiritual war, because it is not to be externalized. It happens within and without at the same time, but what we see on a physical level, again, is the manifestation, is the effect. The cause is in the spiritual realm.
Yeah, and Rudolf Steiner had a really great quote where he basically summarized this, and he says, "Our whole civilization has its origin in the spiritual world. That's where plans are made that govern our life on the physical plane. Down here, we only see how one event after another takes place according to physical laws, but the great spiritual causes are hidden from us. It is events on higher planes of existence that bring about physical events. So spiritual wars manifest physical wars. What happens in the spiritual realms manifests in the physical realms, but it begins in the spiritual realm. It's basically the point that we're making.
Yes, and here's a very great quote by Sri Aurobindo from his Integral Yoga as well. I have mentioned it before in various writings over the years, but it really encapsulates the idea of the spiritual war, and what we see on the physical reality is just the effect. And he writes, "Look at all that is and has been happening in human history. The eye of the yogin, which is the spiritual adept, sees not only the outward events and persons and causes, but the enormous forces which precipitate them into action. If the men who fought were instruments in the hands of rulers and financiers, these, in turn, were mere puppets in the clutch of those hidden occult forces. The apparent freedom and self-assertion of our personal being, to which we are so profoundly attached, conceal a most pitiable subjection to 1,000 suggestions, impulsions, and forces which we have made extraneous to our little person. Our ego, boasting of freedom, is at every moment the slave, toy, and puppet of countless beings, powers, forces, and influences in universal nature. When one is habituated to see things behind, one is no longer prone to be touched by the outward aspects or to expect any remedy from political, institutional, or social changes. The only way out is through the descent of a divine consciousness, which is not the puppet of these forces, but it is greater than they are." And that's really the aim of the great work, to anchor the divine force within ourselves, to bring forth our soul being, the psychic being, to become a conscious transducer of divine will. Hence, as within, so without. That's how we really change the world, through the deeper psycho-spiritual work of this divine embodiment.
Yeah, exactly. So as long as we're stuck in a traumatized state, dysregulated state, looking for external saviors, the external saviors we get are going to be a reflection of our traumatized, dysregulated state. So this is why we're suggesting a change of consciousness. And we also have to realize that I think that the darkness has increased, or at least the unconsciousness has increased. Or, you know, I've read some quotes. I think it was from I forget who it was from, but basically how spirits of the underworld have basically erupted right now when we don't honor our relationship to the divine. Mm-hmm. These dark spirits from the underworld will take over. So we need to, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at it. Like even the other day, I was reading about Plato and his idea of beauty, truth, and goodness, and how these were the foundations of a virtuous life, and just reflecting on how far we have gone from these fundamental values that indicate a good life, or a life well lived, or a virtuous life, whatever you want to call it. And I think we're seeing this loss of the sacred, this loss of the relationship with the divine. We're seeing the symptoms of it everywhere. And I do think even this pull towards a lot of people suddenly becoming Christians and deciding that they need religion in their life is part of this aspect of like people realizing that they need deeper meaning besides what the modern world has prescribed to them.
Exactly.
So
it's still an exoteric approach. What we need is an esoteric
approach.
need
a change of consciousness. Our being needs to change. So instead of even looking for like, oh, if I just go to church every Sunday, I'll be fine. If that creates a change within your being, then yes. But if you're just going there and out of routine, and you're going there asleep and checking your phone or whatever it is you do, it's not creating that change of consciousness. So whatever you do, it has to create a change of being. And that's the change of consciousness that we're pointing out needs to happen.
Yes.
And then that's where we can actually come and create real, or come to the better solutions and create real changes from a change of consciousness. It's like that quote by Albert Einstein, I think it was, is that you can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it.
Yes. I just want to, before you continue, I just want to pipe in real quick, because you made a really important point. What we see even now, just real quick on the political level, with all the different candidates, elections coming up here in the US, craziness, but all over the world, you know, people debate who's better, who's worse, whatever, right? They play their role, but they're still only a reflection of the general collective consciousness of the people.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's why this whole voting yourself out of it is not going to change much unless we become the change.
Yeah. And I also do think that depending on the people who decide to step up, and become leaders, I would argue truly spiritualized people don't tend to get into politics, period. They tend to do other things and find other ways to be of service. However, I'm also open to the idea that through the aspiration of certain leaders and through our change of consciousness, certain leaders can also have higher forces or dark forces working through them
Absolutely.
too. So that's the kind of essential point that you were making earlier, is that we're all being influenced by malevolent forces and benevolent forces.
Yes.
And depending on our level of consciousness, our level of being and our own self-awareness is what forces are we aligning with, basically.
Exactly. And the more we are going back to the point, the importance of the psychospiritual work, because the more we are driven by unconscious shadow, unconscious trauma, unconscious conditioning, socially, culturally, a childhood wounding, whatever it may be, the easier we're manipulated by the hostile, quote unquote, negative forces.
Exactly.
But the more we can bring forth our true self, our true soul being, the more we become channels for higher divine beings.
Yeah, like for example, like you can just notice this in yourself. When you're not in a great mood, when you're feeling down and out or dysregulated or anxious or, just in a dark mood, like you probably tend to gravitate towards things that match that behavior. Like, so for me, for example, when I'm feeling really anxious and dysregulated, this is the worst thing you can do, by the way. Like I'll be like doom scrolling on Twitter and be consuming more of news and, clickbaity headlines that actually make me feel worse. So we tend to also gravitate towards things that affirm our level of consciousness. So it does take an act of will. It does take an act of self-awareness to be like, hey, what's going on with me? What am I noticing in my body? How am I feeling? And then do something that will actually help change that feeling or mitigate that feeling rather than just worsen it.
It requires a certain level of self-awareness, basically.
Yeah, which is what we're going to be going into and talking about in the first hour when we talk especially about embodiment and healing trauma, is that a lot of us aren't aware of our actions and the effect that it's having on our body, on our mental state, on us spiritually. And I think we really need to be aware of that, especially in this internet age. Like I think the internet has become almost like a shadow battleground of like all sorts of dark forces, and it's taking away our creativity. It's taking away our life force. It's distracting us from what we really need to do. So
yes,
that's just as a side note. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this dream that I had. It was actually in late 2019, I remember, because it was when I first moved to the US. So I moved here in 2019 to be with Bernhard, and this was not a normal dream. I don't even think I had like a lot of very clear dreams back then, but this dream was crystal clear. It was very different energy to, the usual dreams I have, which are usually kind of a mixture of like my childhood with like some absurd element in it. So, there's different types of dreams too. So I just want to point that out, that we have dreams that are an aspect of our own psyche. And then we also have dreams that I think are prophetic or even tuning into something that was about to happen in the future. So I consider this dream to be more of a prophetic dream. It didn't have anything to do with anything going on in my life at the moment. And so this dream I had in 2019, I was basically observing the earth from the outside. So I was like above, I could see the whole planet. I could see the whole earth. And I saw this spiritual battle happening in the heavens, like above the earth, which manifests the chaos that we see happening in the physical plane. So in this dream, I saw a black grid that was about to surround the earth. And I was being told, as I was observing this black grid, what was actually happening on earth by a mentor. And he basically showed me that on the earth currently, there's a supramental consciousness, which means a spiritual consciousness that leads to the divinization of the material world. So it's like a higher self-awareness that could cause a collective and global spiritual awakening. It was trying to bring itself down onto the planet. And I saw this higher state of consciousness as a grid of illuminating and pure light encompassing the earth. But then there was this imprisoning black grid overlaid onto this illuminating light that was preventing this from anchoring on the planet. And I was told by this mentor that there was one main program that was preventing this higher state of consciousness from coming down onto the earth. And that was the victim-savior dynamic. So you see this dynamic everywhere, especially in what we call the oppression Olympics. So, everywhere in woke culture, you see this oppressor-oppressed narrative. People only see that through the oppressed-oppressed narrative. That's where this whole conversation about white privilege and having to apologize for your privilege comes from. It's all based on this oppressor-oppressed dynamic, which has its roots in Marxism. So this is an aspect of cultural Marxism. And the main issue with this is that it keeps people in a state of disempowerment. It keeps people also just blaming the outside world for the conditions of their life. That's the primary issue of it, is that you're disempowered as long as you think, oh, the reason why I'm not doing well is because the government, or because I'm not privileged, or because of my race, or because of my gender, or whatever, because then you're depending on the outside world to change before you can feel better. And that's just a fundamentally disempowering position. And so this state of disempowerment also cuts people off from tapping in the state of higher consciousness, which is where guidance from the divine, angelic beings, and other benevolent beings can be experienced. And I find this really interesting because David Hawkins also talked about in his book, Power versus Force, that when you're below a state of 200, which is a fundamental state of disempowerment, it's a contracted energy field, you tend to blame the external world for everything that's going on with you. And the moment that you actually access acceptance and you accept your situation, you take responsibility for it, you reverse the energy field from a contracted state to an expanded state. So in this dream, I saw that to stop people from developing this higher awareness, they are not just killing them because then they would just enter the reincarnation cycle again, but they were essentially traumatizing them so that they become disconnected from their essence, also known as their true self. You could also think of it as their soul, which is the connection that they need for their higher self or their angel to reach them through. So by traumatizing them and disconnecting from their soul and the guidance of their angels and the divine, it turned souls into portals for hostile occult forces to keep them enacting their agenda through the earth via constant stream of divide and conquer. And it was interesting because at the end of this dream, they ended up going after and killing the mentor who told me this. And I won't say who it is, but a few years later, during the whole COVID craziness, I watched that mentor fall for much of the most divisive of woke ideology himself, also fall for the vaccine. It was like the dream showed me that the darkness would get to him too. And I didn't even know that back then. Yes. But then when I saw it play out later, I was like, oh my God, like that was like...
Was it 2019?
2019, yeah. And so what we're going to also refer to, Bernhard's going to read in a moment, is that a Sufi mystic also described this spiritual battle as a wall of some sort. And this wall basically disconnects people from the light. And this wall has been built by humans, by us, our ideologies, our shadows, our unconsciousness, our ignorance, and our deliberate turning away from the light, meaning that humans created it, and therefore we can also dismantle it. And this is really not an easy journey, but we have to take it in our own way with our inner work, with our spiritual practice. We can realize this light within ourselves and dismantle whatever is in the way that's subduing the light from entering our hearts. So we really need to become spiritual warriors, and in order to dismantle this grid or this wall. And the only thing that's going to help us win this spiritual war, which is what manifests these physical wars, is a change of consciousness that allows each individual to remember their true nature as a divine spark of God. So it's a change of being that needs to happen. Like, you can read all the spiritual books in the world, you can pray every single night, but unless your being changes, it doesn't matter. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. So that's what we're going to give advice for. And we're going to, if you could talk about also the Sufi mystics interpretation, it's very interesting.
Yeah. I just want to comment because it's really fascinating, your dream. And I remember it as well when you shared it before. But what you said, it's really very extremely prophetic and very insightful, even some very deep, esoteric, occult mechanisms or laws are happening there. The idea of the Matrix trauma installment program, we talked about this before. by traumatizing people, disconnecting them from their soul and guidance, from their own angels, from the divine, from their creative spirit. It turns people literally into portals for the hostile forces. And that is how the spiritual world works. It works through us. That's really the amazing key point. As long as you only externalize the evil out there and you think you're virtuous, that's how also the matrix, these forces of Vertigo gets to you. But I really want to now share a very fascinating vision of a Sufi sheikh, a Sufi mystic by the name of Llewellyn von Lee, called The Wall. We have talked about this, I think, over a year ago and mentioned it briefly in one of our podcasts. But now, in light of Laura's dream and everything else that's happening in the world, it gives tremendous insight into the state of the world and, more importantly, what needs to be done to heal the world and heal ourselves. So it's a long text, so I'm kind of just quoting some major aspects of it, and then we'll comment and talk more about it. So here he goes, the vision of the wall. In deep meditation, I came to a wall. I know this wall. I've seen it many times before in meditation and waking visions. It is a high brick wall. I know what it is on the other side of the wall. A world of light. But there's no way through. There's no doorway, no ladder, no break in the wall. When I come to the wall, I walk along it, and then I have to turn away, back to the narrow streets of this world. Sometimes I've made every effort and clambering to the top, looked over the wall. Or I've just felt what is there, endless expanses of light and the beings of light who live there. And yet always I have to come back into this world, so constricted and full of shadows, the half-light of our existence. In the summer of 2008, I spent 3 weeks on the other side, in that world of light. It was a crazy time. I was very ill and hardly slept. When I went to bed and closed my eyes, I was in the world of light. There was no need to sleep, no possibility of sleep. There was so much light, light upon light. Sometimes during the day too, I was fully awake in the world of light. I could see our world from the other side, see its loves and hopes and dreams, its worldly power structures and places of prayer. I could see the spiritual essence of every tree and flower and the patterns of darkness in which people are so caught. And I saw the beings of light that are waiting for us, that want to help us. And I saw how we have forgotten them. I saw the sticky substance of forgetfulness that covers us and drains away any remembrance we may have. I saw how other beings of darkness that belong to this world also drain our light, keep us caught, cover us in greed and desire, hatred and anger. And I saw that this is how it is. But I could not live forever in this world of light, even though I longed to. There was too much light. It burned into my consciousness. It did not allow me to sleep. I knew I had to come back. My body and mind could not live any longer in that world of light, and it was not yet time for me to fully die. I knew this, even as I longed to be released, even as I pleaded and complained, was angry and resentful. I had to come back. My body and mind had to be healed from being exposed to such an intensity of light. And afterwards, over the weeks and months that followed, this is what slowly happened. But why was I shown it like this, always a brick wall? It is not a river of forgetfulness, a veil of light, or a rainbow bridge. It is made of bricks, and bricks belong to this world. And then suddenly it dawned on me. This wall was made brick by human beings. It is not a natural separation between the worlds. It has been purposely built by people, by their ideologies, laws, and power structures. Humanity had purposely created a wall of separation between the physical world and the world of light. And it had been built so long ago and been so effective that we all accept it. Now we live in the shadow of this wall without even noticing it. Nor do we realize that we have been denied our heritage of light. We have been conditioned to accept the world of shadows and half-truths we call life, without even realizing that we are cut off from the world of light. This has become our heritage. We have successfully stranded ourselves from the divine. It is so long since the light was here that we have almost no memories, even in our ancestral consciousness, of how to live in the light. We've learned how to live in the shadowlands of our culture, how to manipulate and deceive. But in the light, there can be no manipulation or deception. There's too much light. We have to learn once again how to be honest and truthful, how to be sincere and open, how to take real responsibility. This is the only way to live in the light. There are and have been pockets of light, But these harbingers of light do not appear to last. They self-destruct, destroyed by drugs, for example, or are swallowed back into collective, sold out to materialistic values. Sadly, much of the New Age spirituality that brought the light and the practices of spiritual traditions from the East soon became corrupted and self-serving. We know in our depths that humanity and the world itself cannot survive much longer without the light that comes directly from the source. Everything else has become too polluted and corrupted. The heart of the world is bleeding, and the soul of humanity is crying out. We need this light in order to see our true nature and the true nature of life. And life needs this light in order to heal and transform so that together we can make the next step in evolution. So in this extended text, then he also goes on to describe how the light of the divine could destroy the wall. Even the light beings, these powerful beings, could destroy the wall, but it is up to humanity to turn to the divine and dismantle the wall, since we have built it over thousands of years. So it's up to us to learn our lessons, not wait for others to save us, basically. Why? Because it was a conscious choice to separate from God and the worship of ego, as he says. This all is now also manifested and strengthened by the dark forces, right, that feed on humanity and tag into all that is corrupted within us. So through the rise of the wall, we've also given the dark forces more power that sustain the wall. As he said, he saw powerful light beings on the other side as well, but they are not going to just to bail us out or destroy the wall for us. This is our task again, and our spiritual lesson, hence the necessity to engage in this inner psycho-spiritual work, to bring forth the light within ourselves, which will destroy the wall. But he also mentioned that currently humanity would not even be able to handle the full light of the divine. We need to open ourselves to it progressively via the inner work and the aspiration to the divine to hold this extremely high frequency of the divine light. And I want to finish with one last quote. He says, or writes, "The Sufis describe how we need actually separation between the worlds. 70 veils of light and darkness, or the glories of his face would burn away everything. As I know from my own experiences, the light of the divine is too dazzling for us to perceive it directly. Its energy is too strong. This is one of the reasons why spiritual life is a slow process, a gradual lifting of the veils. As one develops spiritual strength, becomes more and more able to bear the light. But these veils filter the light. They are not a wall that cuts off from it." So really understanding that there's a natural separation between the spiritual world of pure light and the human consciousness. Out of necessity, there needs to be gradual evolution, because we would not be able to anchor the full light. It would literally destroy us. It's like trying to put in 1,000 volts through a cable that can only hold 2 volts or something like that. It would burst. But what we have now going on, there's an artificial separation, the wall created by us and maintained by us and then reinforced by hostile dark forces that is not natural, that we need to dismantle ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that this is why powerful spiritual experiences can only be experienced in little increments for most people. I know when I have had my most powerful spiritual experience, it's extremely disorientating. It's very hard to manage a certain level of consciousness that's very different from your baseline level of consciousness in the real world. Stalinist Grof even talked about how we can slip into a spiritual emergency where we can go basically insane from experiencing these peak experiences. And the way that I see it is like, for example, say if you take an extremely traumatized, let's just say an animal for the purposes of this reflection, extremely traumatized animal, and then you bring it into a house that's safe and loving and unconditionally caring towards it, and it gets all its needs met. Is that animal going to be able to suddenly receive that love right away? No, it's not. It's actually going to bite the owner. It's going to freak out. It's going to growl, And that's kind of our relationship when we're deeply traumatized to the divine, is that we can't, no, it's true. We can't actually contain it because of our own trauma, because of our own core beliefs, because of our own wounds. And I also see that a lot of people, especially because of all the loss and death we've had over the past few years, their hearts are shut down from the grief as well. So,
but even this Sufi mystic in his vision of the wall, as he entered the world of light, he wasn't able to sustain it himself. He was too strong. His body was, disintegrating. But he made what also came to me, because we need a reversal in the old ways of religions, even spirituality, was about escaping life, escaping into the afterlife, escaping Maya and transcending, getting out of body, away. But we need a reversal, as Sri Abhinanda Mother has said. We need to actually break the wall and bring down divine, the supramental consciousness that you also perceive, that wants to descend, that wants to anchor itself in the earth and transmute and spiritualize life, mind, and matter.
Yeah.
But it happens gradually. But it's about anchoring the force, not going to it, not going and leaving the world and leaving the world behind. And that was the lesson he learned as well.
Yeah.
He so badly wanted to just stay up there, but from a divine perspective, no, the work is to be done here in the shadows to bring down the light.
And I've had little moments of that in my own spiritual practice, only when I was really meditating hours a day and doing yoga a day. But I've had moments where even my consciousness burst out of my body and I could feel the consciousness of the whole room. And there's a part of your ego that freaks out when you have these experiences. Like if you were to be blasted with the unconditional love of the divine, there's a part of you that will freak out. That's what I think he's pointing at.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about the practical tools that we think are really necessary for this change of consciousness. And the reason why we point at psycho-spiritual work is because we need the psychological work along with the spiritual work in order to create a truly embodied change. So when we do psychological work without spiritual work, then we often end up digging in the mud, and we always end up in our childhood. It always ends up somewhere in our childhood most of the time. However, spiritual work expands that point of view and lets us know that there's a future self, a higher self that's also pulling us forward. And it also opens us up to the spiritual sciences and the spiritual realms, that there are benevolent forces as well as hostile forces. And we need to know how to navigate these through changing our level of being, through clearing out the traumas and wounds that keep us identified in unconsciousness so that we can align with these higher forces. So one of the main things, which we'll just briefly touch on, is holding the tension of opposites. So for those who want a more in-depth description of this, check out our previous podcast. I think it was 2 podcasts ago, or maybe 1 podcast ago. How can we heal this polarized world? Basically, Jung's idea on this is that the psyche always has pairs of opposites. So we have light and dark, feminine and masculine, positive and negative. And these inner forces must balance in order to create a third thing. And a third thing is a transcendent function of the self, which is, i.e., the growing of consciousness. So you see this tension of opposites going on constantly in the polarization in the world. Mainly, actually, we see it in America, at least, and actually now the whole world, this whole liberal and conservative side of it. And the thing is the far left is creating more of the far right. And that's the kind of the pendulum swinging between the opposites. And the real work, which we talk about more in depth in this podcast, is to, rather than just being I used to be a woke leftist and now I'm a right-wing conservative. That's you identifying with one side of the opposites. And it creates fanaticism and it actually strengthens the other side. That's the problem. So the more extreme the far left goes, the more a far right will naturally emerge.
And vice versa.
Yeah. So what we're trying to suggest is, rather than identifying with either sides of these polarities, however they show up in your life, beyond just liberal and conservative, if you can hold this tension, which involves shadow work, which involves withdrawing your projections, which we'll talk about in a moment, then you start to create a growing of consciousness, a third way, a third path that wasn't there before.
And I also want to just point out there's sometimes certain misconception when people just intellectualize the process of what it really is about, holding the tension of opposites. Hence, again, if you're not aware of it, what it means, check out our previous podcast. But holding the tension of opposites is not an intellectual exercise. It is not that the truth is in the middle of 2 extremes, for example. That would be the middle ground fallacy, not necessarily. It also doesn't imply neutrality nor inaction. A lot of people mistake this concept concept of holding the tension of opposites for just being impartial and neutral and all that. That's not the case either. It also doesn't imply non-action. So it's very important to understand, as Laura just mentioned, it's a deep inner psycho-spiritual process, really.
It's an inner process. It's not an external one.
Exactly. That creates, from an esoteric perspective, through the friction holding the tension within the alchemical fire that gives birth to the third force out of the two.
The transcendent function, which is a connection to the divine, which is growing in consciousness, i.e. the self.
Exactly. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Okay, and one of the foundations, which brings us to our second tool, is shadow work. So we have so many podcasts about this. But the reason that we're pointing this out is because the world seems to have descended into a collective identification with the shadow. One of the shadows I think we're dealing with collectively is actually the shadow of totalitarianism, which is showing up on both sides, really predominantly on the left. And mainly we see it because people are just getting triggered and projecting onto the other side all the evil they see in the world. So in order to hold the tension of the opposites, this begins with engaging in shadow work. And you can see this actually, so simple practice, like let's even take about like what's going on in America politically, which we speak to because we're in the US right now. Can you see parts in the left side and the right side living within you, even the parts that you don't like? So, on the left, you see this kind of controlling, woke ideology. On the right, you see this kind of dogmatic, fundamentalist Christian vibe. It's kind of, there's many different ways that plays out, but we need to be comfortable with noticing our own triggers, our own projections towards the other side. And rather than just making a tweet that this side is responsible for all the evil in the world, can we reflect on what's going on within us? So this means becoming curious about our triggers and projections towards other people. We also have a masterclass about this. What is it called? Embodied Shadow Work and the Path of Individuation. We go in this really in depth in our Embodied Soul Awakening program. But it's basically noticing your triggers and projections and learning how to withdraw them. And in doing so, we grow in consciousness. So some reflection questions is what kind of people or groups trigger a strong emotional reaction within me. So you're looking for the ones that have the most charge. That's where you would want to begin. What kind of emotions come up when I think of this group or person? And then reflecting what are the particular traits that this person or group has that really trigger me the most. So already you have to start to become honest with yourself, because if we're identified with a self-righteous part of ourselves, then we'll be like, well, I'm never like that. I'm not like that. So it takes humility. It takes curiosity to even begin this process, because automatically a lot of us want to identify as a good person. So looking at the shadow is by nature uncomfortable.
I also want to add to that also, shadow work is not easy. It's messy. It's not contemplation. It brings up a lot of stuff we don't like to feel.
Yes.
Ties into holding the tension of opposites. And also your mind will rationalize and justify your self-righteousness of why these other, your projections, whatnot. And this is also exactly where these occult forces tag or vertigo tag into you to give you justifications or all kinds of reasons on why to project or hate on the other side.
Yeah, you'll feel like shit at first, but the more you do this, the more that you actually start to retrieve qualities of your own self. So and not only that, so say if like you get you get triggered by people calling you certain names, like, so if someone calls you like a bitch or stupid or whatever, something that is classically deemed to be bad, if you do shadow work on that part of yourself, then when someone else projects that on you, you're not going to explode. You're not going to blow up. You might just be like, oh yeah, I can be a little bit of an asshole sometimes. Okay. And so you also become more immune to other people's shadow projections. So it's a very powerful piece of work, but it doesn't feel good at first. And that's how you know you're doing it actually right, because it feels like you're swallowing poison. So you want to reflect on the traits that you see in groups of people or a person that trigger you the most. Then asking yourself, who do these traits remind me of? Like, when have I experienced this before? And that usually opens a gateway to what parts of your personal history are being triggered. So kind of going back into childhood dynamics, we tend to get really triggered by traits of people who hurt us the most, usually our parents. And if they are our parents, you want to reflect on how you may personally have had those traits, at least in potential within yourself. So this is where it gets a little bit more nuanced, but another thing that I see, so say if you had a parent who was lying all the time, and then you decided to take up the opposite trait and you'd be like, I'm going to be truthful 100% of the time. First of all, it's not possible. You're never being truthful 100% of the time. Meaning like when you go to the grocery store and someone asks you how you feeling, are you being truthful 100% of the time, or you just say, good, I'm feeling great? So another way that the shadow gets exiled into the unconsciousness is that we identify with the other side of the polarity and we don't accept the other side within us. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So you want to reflect on how you could see yourself expressing the trait that you find disgusting in other people, at least in potential. And if you can't see it in potential, then maybe even reflecting on experiences where that trait would be useful. So let's just take like the experience of like being a bitch, for example. You know, sometimes especially for women, if you're like being harassed by a guy on the street, like this happened to me actually in my travels when I was traveling internationally, sometimes being a bitch and being a bit rude is the only way that you can make them go away. So you're looking for the gold within these shadow traits. And this is just a primer. There's exceptions to this. There's also archetypal evil, which you should not integrate, but you want to begin to reflect on this in the world because it actually doesn't feel good long-term to just keep projecting your shadow. Your ego may feel good temporarily, but then you're living in the unconscious mud of your shadow all the time. And it's like this dark cloud that follows you. Yeah. Okay. So this is also a really important topic and one that we can mainly just give suggestions for, but is really an ongoing process, which is healing trauma. And the reason why we're talking about this is because the past few years have been quite traumatic for many. I've noticed that many people live in a state of chronic fight, flight, or freeze that can sometimes be hard to detect. They might not even know that they're in this state. So it can show up in doom scrolling, like spending just hours scrolling on the phone. It can show up in avoiding life. It can show up in depression, low energy, all sorts of chronic illness. Procrastination can be an aspect of that. So big T trauma, which is a major event like a death, a major abuse, etc., is too much too fast. So something happened that was too much for you to integrate in the moment, and then it gets stored in your body. Whereas little T trauma, also known as developmental trauma, is when too little has happened for too long. So you haven't gotten the right love and support and care that you need to be healthy for too long. And so some essential tools for this, I mean, number one, I really want to note what they call in polyvagal theory called the social engagement system. So healing trauma in isolation is not as effective as connecting to others, reaching out to others for when we need support. It's such a crucial aspect of this. And not just getting a therapist, even though we do recommend that can be a great tool for support. But when you're feeling down, when you're feeling stressed, do you have someone you can talk to? Do you have an outlet for that? Like, it's so critical. And I think we're becoming so overly isolated because the moment that we engage with our social engagement system, it actually creates a parasympathetic response that relaxes us and makes us feel safe. So it gives us a cue of safety the moment that we share about our experience to another person and we feel heard. So it's so crucial to build these kinds of relationships and networks. And if you don't have them, to seek them out, to look for them. And another essential tool would just be being aware and tracking your nervous system on a day-to-day basis. So noticing your habits, what gives you energy, what makes you feel calm, what habits help you gain energy, get life force to do what you need to do, what habits tend to trigger your stress. Do you have ways that you can trigger states of relaxation? when you're dealing with certain strong emotions, what skills or tools do you have that can help you calm down or process that emotion consciously? So, for example, is if your work is a state of stress, do you have ways that you can create moments of relaxation? Or maybe do you have boundaries that you can implement in your work so you don't overload yourself? Can you go for a short walk or engage in some breathing exercises after a stressful moment to wind down? So paying attention to your nervous system on a day-to-day basis is the way that you can regulate it. And if you just notice yourself just chronically just drained and you don't have the energy to do what you need to do with the day, and you end up going to bed, and then when you finally in bed, you just get this cortisol surge and you can't go to sleep, then this is something to really focus on. And we also want to look at how stress and trauma can make us live in a state of hypervigilance all the time. So hypervigilance meaning you're looking for signs of danger and you're constantly looking for the next thing that can go wrong. So noticing, like, what do you orient to, meaning what do you focus on in your environment? Are you constantly looking for signs of danger, or are you orienting towards cues of safety? So for example, I think a lot of people tend to end up in doom scrolling because of what happened in the past few years. And they're like, oh, what's the next psyop? What's the next thing that the deep state is going to do? And they're orienting towards signs of danger and hypervigilance. And then they're creating more stress in their bodies rather than orienting towards cues of safety, which should be spending time in nature, showing affection to a pet or someone you love, you know, finding things that bring you joy and make you feel calm and safe and relaxed, like curling up in a cozy blanket, whatever it is. You want to notice what you're consuming and how that affects your own inner state, and how can you orient towards things that make you feel a sense of safety instead of constantly looking for the next thing to go wrong. Which also leads me into the last another connected point, and then we'll just maybe cover one more point after that, and we'll leave the rest for the second hours. But embodiment practices and grief work are really important. So these are tied together. So a lot of people ask me, how can I grieve? And we can only get into grief when our body feels safe to do so. So if we're in a chronic state of fight, flight, freeze, we're operating in a state of survival, and the body is storing and holding onto the repressed emotions while we're just focusing on, like, how can we get through this day? So the grief won't come up if you're in a state of survival. So we need to soften into the tension in our bodies in order to release those emotions. So having some sort of daily practice, whether it's breath work or yoga, qigong, dance, somatic meditation, all of these we do in our course, but you can also do it on your own too. There's like so many free resources out there, even on YouTube alone, but you need the will to actually engage in this. You need to break out of your own patterns. You need to realize that even though it takes some inner friction to do something that's outside of your regular everyday kind of pattern, when you do it, you're going to feel better and it's going to help you significantly. And if you're not the kind of person who has enough motivation or will to engage in a spiritual practice, what about just taking a hot bath without phones or distractions, just noticing what you feel in your body? Dancing is also free. Massage, acupuncture can help too, but whatever you do, it's ideal to have some sort of daily practice or at least a few times a week that you're connecting to your body. And embodiment in general means resting your awareness in your body on a day-to-day basis and doing check-ins throughout the day and honoring what your body needs. So a lot of us tend to live in the head, live in the mental realm, and we avoid everything from our neck down. And this is also encouraged when we live in an era of media consumption, which just keeps us in the head, keeps us with more information. So if that's not something that you're used to, these spiritual practices can get you accustomed to resting the consciousness in your body.
I also want to add to that, embodiment is really key. So embodiment is not just also exercising. We can also use exercise as a trauma response, to dissociate, actually build more muscle armor and all of that. But what's key point of embodiment, it also actually has its root word in soul integration, really embodying your soul, your true self, but conscious embodiment practices like Laura just mentioned. And I want to really emphasize the importance of movement. I've gotten more back into movement practices. Dance is particularly ecstatic dance, 5 rhythm dance. You can do it at home. And the key point of movement practice is to get out of our habitual way of moving or sitting or doing things. We have all these patterns. The older we get, they kind of mirror almost our ingrained patterns of thinking, behaving, speaking, our whole psychology, right? So the more we break out of these patterns through the movement, we also open up neural pathways in the brain, which can actually heal trauma and release things. And dance or any other things are very, very powerful in that regard. So whenever you do any embodiment practice or movement practices, don't distract yourself while listening to a podcast or music. While you dance, you obviously listen to music, but have a certain awareness within yourself as well of how you move, so you get more in touch with your physical body as well.
Yeah, and we'll have to save the rest, critical thinking and occult forces, for the second hour. But I just wanted to add on to something that you said as well. So if you're someone who's like in a chronic state of freeze and you have these symptoms that I'm talking about, which mainly is like procrastination, checking out, doom scrolling, low energy, often what you need to do is you need to get into sympathetic, meaning an activating action, in order to downregulate. So you can't just like go from like doom scrolling to like sitting and breathing. That could actually just make you feel worse. So what I recommend, and something I think we even have a practice in our course, is to go for a walk if you want music, it's fine, like as long as it's like more calming music, but go for a walk and orient towards signs of beauty, orient towards the goodness in the world. So like notice the trees, notice the flowers, notice the people who are smiling and in a good mood, and just notice how that feels. Because a lot of us, I notice this hypervigilance I was just sharing about, we will go to like the grocery store in like a state of like paranoia and stress. And then that creates more stress in our bodies. And then we get home and we're burnt out and we just doom scroll. So this is a moment to moment awareness of noticing what you tend to place your awareness on and how that affects the emotions in your body. So taking these conscious walks where you orient towards signs of beauty and safety in your environment is really powerful, because you're both getting into a sympathetic response, which then gets you into a down-regulating parasympathetic response. So essentially you create energy in order to calm yourself down, or you activate yourself in order to calm yourself down. And as well, you're learning how to pay attention, what you orient to, and how that affects your body. So
excellent points.
So yeah, we kind of went a little bit over on this first hour. So we're going to save these last 2 points for the second hour. So for those who are newer to our podcast, we always create a second hour to the podcast. You can go to veilofreality.com/membership to join up for the second hour. And in the second hour, what we're going to talk about is critical thinking and also understanding occult forces in Wetiko. And we're also going to talk about why these political candidates are a reflection of the level of consciousness of the people. Sri Aurobindo's warning of a socialist one world government, the importance of developing true virtues as opposed to virtue signaling.
Yes.
How to access the true self. Another skill as well that we find is crucial for these times is the importance of being of service and having compassion for others, but not blind compassion. And we'll talk about what that is. And then we'll cover some basics of psychic self-defense and how to work with prayer in this spiritual war.
Exactly. So again, sign up to the second hour at veilofreality.com if you're not a member yet. And if you're interested to be notified when we start the next run of Embodied Soul Awakening via application and registration, go to thetimeoftransition.com and you can find out more about our 14-week course. Enrollment will start in a couple of weeks. And with that being said, see you on the other side. Thanks for listening.